There's no other series quite like Goosebumps. It's horror, but it manages to somehow remain tolerable for children while still retaining some of its scary moments. Horror movies can be a little too scary for kids, but Goosebumps isn't so scarring. Of course, that doesn't mean that it didn't scar me a few times as a kid. I remember watching this show and getting scared during episodes like The Haunted Mask and Welcome to Dead House, but what really got me was this Wendy's Kids Meal DVD game. This tree monster from Stay Out of the Basement's cover art definitely scarred me as a kid for some reason. Although I remember it looking a lot more sinister than it actually does. But that wouldn't be the only Goosebumps game that I would ever play. I would eventually get Goosebumps Horrorland for the DS one day, and while I do remember playing it, I could never remember much about it. I never finished it, and I wasn't sure why. Given that it is October, and I've been wanting to revisit the Goosebumps series for a while now, this was as good of a time as any to finally sit down and play this game. Goosebumps Horrorland released on the day before Halloween in 2008, and while it did also release on the Wii and PS2, I wanted to stick with the DS version, seeing as that was always the one I played as a kid. I expected this would come with some downsides, but this game is shockingly decent for a DS game. It's fully 3D, and while it obviously can't compare to the Wii and PS2, the graphics are pretty good for DS standards. However, one of the things that stood out to me the most is that this game has voice acting. And I don't mean a couple of basic lines reused constantly. The characters actually speak full sentences in these cutscenes.
Admit one to the grand opening of Horrorland, where nightmares come to life.
Whatever.
It was pretty impressive to see, even if they are obviously a bit compressed to fit onto the game. Speaking of cutscenes, the game opens with one that shows a horror, the monsters that run Horrorland, leaving a ticket to Horrorland on our protagonist's doorstep. The protagonist takes the ticket and rips it up, but it magically puts itself back together, and his friend Nate had the same thing happen to him too. They both go to Horrorland for some reason, and once we get inside, we soon learn that we can't leave. This brings us to the first area of the park, the Carnival of Screams. There are 6 attractions in each area of the park, and to escape, we're going to have to earn frights from the attractions. The first attraction I tried was Dead Ringer, which was one of those test of strength games. You have to hold your stylus on the hammer to make it swing faster, but it gets really hard to keep the stylus on the hammer when it's moving so fast. I was able to get a 9 on my first try, but to get the gold on this game, you need to get a 10. As I kept playing, I couldn't get the 10, even when getting the hammer to the max speed, and I eventually ran out of tokens. When this happens, you have to find more by checking objects like trash cans and trees. After collecting tokens and returning to Dead Ringer, I was able to somehow get the 10 despite feeling like I didn't really do anything differently. But even though Dead Ringer was a little annoying to fully complete, I did think it was decently fun. And seeing the skeleton's head fly off made it feel just a bit more satisfying. However, Dead Ringer pales in comparison to the next attraction I tried, Bumper Carnage. This was easily my favorite attraction in the entire game, and there's 2 main reasons for that. The first is that it's just fun, since it's basically bumper cars but with a giant pit in the middle during the last 30 seconds. I never really got tired of destroying all these kids in this game, even after playing it hundreds of times. This leads to the second reason why I like this attraction so much. It gives you an insane amount of tokens. You could just scrounge up tokens in the trash, but this was way better, since I could just sit back and bully these kids while stockpiling tokens. Which is another reason why this is so great for farming tokens. Objects in the park will stop giving you tons of tokens when you hoard them, but here, you can hoard as much as you want. I have hours and hours of footage playing this attraction, and I never really got tired of it. So I think that alone proves how good this attraction is. But of course, I had to move on to other attractions eventually if I wanted to finish the game. So it's time for the Wheel of Misfortune. This attraction is pretty simple. You run by sliding the stylus back and forth, jump at the right time, and try to land on the wheel for big points. It only took me a few tries to win the gold, and it didn't really overstay its welcome. Next up was Horrorland Derby, which was like one of those racing games you see at amusement parks. You roll the balls into specific holes, and your character will do those actions. It didn't take me long to get a feel for it, and I managed to win on my first try. Continuing the trend of easy attractions was Monster Mash, a simple game where you have to throw balls at enemies to score points. It took me a few tries to get the gold because the throwing is a bit janky. You have to press a button to lock on, and then slide your stylus up to throw the ball. It's weird, but after a few attempts, I was able to get good and become the Master Monster Masher. Finally, we have Calamity Canyon, the last attraction in the Carnival of Screams. This was probably the hardest attraction for me here, since it gets pretty fast. You're stuck on a roller coaster that's slowly falling apart, and if your screamometer reaches the red, it's game over. To get the gold, you need to avoid crashing the coaster and put your hands up when you're going down a slope to keep the screamometer down. I had to memorize some of the track in order to avoid certain things, but I was able to finally get the gold with enough attempts. With the Carnival of Screams fully completed, I was surprised to see a new pop-up in the corner saying card number 21. This is when I learned about the monster cards, which are essentially achievements. I figured if I was already trying to get the gold on every attraction, I might as well go for these too. I like these because not only do they add some more variety to the game, but the rewards are also pretty cool. The cards have the iconic Goosebumps book covers on them, and the text helps give some context for those who didn't read every book. I went back and grabbed the rest of the ones I missed in the Carnival of Screams, which was mostly easy except for the Horrorland Derby one, since that one was pretty specific and I could not get that order down. I did eventually get it, but it took a while. With all my monster cards and gold frights in hand, I continued on to the next area, Vampire Village. We get another cutscene with our friend Nate, who decides to go into a coffin for some reason, and afterwards, he's gone. Now we're truly on our own, stuck in an evil theme park with no way to go other than forward. Vampire Village is a lot more interesting of an area than the Carnival of Screams. It's this town with blood-red rivers, a giant castle in the middle, and vampires everywhere. But when I first got here, all I could think about was that I felt like I had heard this music somewhere before. And I don't mean that I've heard it from this game before. I've heard this same song somewhere else. So I did some digging and eventually found out that I wasn't crazy. This same song was actually used in I Spy Spooky Mansion for mobile devices way back in the day. You can tell how old this is given that they show a very old iPhone model, and you can't even download this game nowadays, since it's no longer supported by modern Apple devices. I guess Scholastic just used this song as general creepy music when they needed it, but I found it pretty interesting to recognize a song from a completely different game. But let's talk about the attractions of Vampire Village, since that's what we're really here for. First up was Garlic Crusher, which was similar to Monster Mash. You have to throw garlic at these vampires as they get up from their coffins. This doesn't really seem that interesting, but the one thing I liked about it was that the garlic actually had some physics to it. You had to aim your shots well, and sometimes you could even get crazy ricochets if you're lucky enough. After getting the gold in a few attempts, I moved on to the batting cages. This attraction isn't too bad, although I didn't find it to be that enjoyable. You usually end up having to wait for the bats to come to you, and all that waiting can make it feel like a slog. Its one redeeming quality is the announcer, who says "home run" every time you get a home run. I didn't have too much trouble getting the gold, but the monster card for this game was driving me batty. This monster card requires you to hit 5 home runs in a row, which is incredibly annoying. I couldn't figure out exactly what caused a home run after theorizing for hours. I couldn't tell if it was the timing, the position of the bat, or both. I could get some consistency if I was able to line up the bat's eyes right over the protagonist's shoulders, but I wasn't able to find consistent setups for other angles. Another big issue with getting 5 in a row is that you'll often get 2 bats coming at you at the same time. And since they're close enough to get hit, you'll hit both of them together, but they won't both be home runs, which means that your streak is reset. It was incredibly annoying, and after tons of grinding, I ultimately decided to just use save states for this one to get the card. This was probably one of the hardest things I had to deal with in the whole game, but this is nothing compared to what would come soon. The next attraction I tried was Flash Fright, a game about keeping vampires away using just a flashlight. I was kind of struggling on this, but after taking a break for a day, I came back and got the gold first try. The trick that helped me get the gold was just being efficient with the flashlight's limited battery. I wouldn't waste much time when using it, and I would try to get 2 or 3 vampires at the same time. I can't hate this attraction, but it just felt like a generic game with a Goosebumps coat of paint on it. I do think it is a bit creepy though, especially for kids. This definitely brought back some memories of being scared of these vampires with those evil looks on their faces as they slowly creep towards you. And that scream they emit when you shine the light on them for long enough. That was enough for me to not want to play this attraction anymore as a kid. I wasn't losing sleep over this attraction, but it definitely creeped me out just enough for me to remember it. And next up was Coffin Cruise, an attraction that was actually based off of the story that started Horrorland. This was one of the attractions that the protagonist actually went on during the story, and this wasn't the only reference to the original work in the game. The horror's weakness being pinching was something that I had just assumed they made up for the game, but I actually learned that it was from the original book. It was altered in the TV show, which is why I never knew about it. But it's these things that make the game feel a bit more higher quality than I initially believed it was. Getting back on track, Coffin Cruise is just a ride where you have to paddle your coffin while avoiding obstacles. I got the gold pretty easily, and it was fine. I didn't really find it to be memorable or anything, but it also didn't overstay its welcome. But oh man, the next attraction was one of my favorites. Putt Cemetery is a mini golf course with 3 holes, and I'm a sucker for mini golf. I love playing mini golf, even if I force myself to go for all the gimmicks that just tend to fuck me over in the end. But clearly I must have some skill at mini golf since I managed to gold this first try. I messed up a bit on the first 2 holes, but had a massive hole 3 where I got 4 below par. I was pretty hyped to have made such a comeback, but I can't lie when I say that I was a bit sad I finished it so fast. Out of all of the attractions at Vampire Village so far, this was my favorite, and it took the least amount of time. However, there was one more attraction left, and that attraction was Roller Coaster. There's actually a small cutscene that plays before this ride, showing a little girl trapped on the ride, and the only one who can save her is our protagonist. So we get on the ride and try to save her. This ride is basically an on-rail shooter, and it doesn't use the janky controls that other games did. It's just point and press a button to shoot. I thought this one was pretty fun, but it didn't take me long to finish it and save the girl. The monster police chase us down, but after escaping, she tells us her name is Gigi and to meet her at the Cursed Carriage, her hiding place. She tells us that the only way we can get out is with our ripped up ticket, so we need to find all the pieces for it. There's one in each area of the park, but the monster police will attempt to capture you. Their AI isn't so great, but they do have a weakness: pinching. I honestly didn't care too much about the ticket finding, since I would just have to walk around for a few minutes until I got close enough for her to tell me where it was. But I guess it adds a bit of variety into what was starting to become a bit stale. Now that we've saved Gigi, we gain access to the next 2 areas: Fever Swamp and Mad Labs. Fever Swamp was where the game started to become less fun and far more tedious for me. I like the swamp theme since there's several Goosebumps episodes that take place there, and I just like the way the park is split up into multiple areas overall. It really makes this feel like a massive theme park rather than just some rundown place with 2 rides and a bunch of monsters. There's an incredible atmosphere in the park, but that atmosphere gets ruined when the attractions start becoming too tough. Swamp Stomp was a bit annoying, but I got the hang of it and beat the horror. However, to get the gold, you have to win with no warnings? That seemed a little strange, but after a few resets, I got it without too much trouble. But next up was Anchors Away, and this one really frustrated me. Anchors Away is the start of the trend of repeat attractions. There's a decent chunk of these in the game, and while they are different in some ways, they're generally the same gameplay as you would find in earlier attractions. Anchors Away is basically just Dead Ringer, but the anchor is harder to spin because it's smaller and you have to slide up instead of down. I found this one to be pretty annoying, and I wasn't even able to get the gold at first. I ended up using all of my tokens, so I had to go back to Bumper Carnage and bully these kids for their tokens before I could return. After making my way back to Fever Swamp, I managed to get the gold on my first attempt, which was a major relief for me. I quickly moved on to the next attraction, which was Tilt-A-Web. At first, I thought this was going to be some ride like a Tilt-A-Whirl you see at amusement parks. But then I found out that it's just Wheel of Misfortune again. But this time, you have to have better timing and can't stay in the air for as long. The wheel is also different, so getting the gold is much harder. I could not get the jump timing down at all for some reason, and it made this attraction pretty frustrating. However, the biggest issue here is that if you don't run fast enough and the wheel is in just the right spot, then you'll jump in the air right as the 300 is passing by. If you don't have the perfect reaction to hit this, then you have to wait for the wheel to do a full spin, which usually won't be possible unless you manage to run at the fastest speed. I ended up spending all of my tokens yet again, and that meant another half an hour of bullying kids for their tokens. But honestly, I think these breaks were kind of needed, since playing the same attraction over and over again while failing every time was driving me insane. After returning to Tilt-A-Web, I managed to get the gold after a few more tries. It was relieving, but I was beginning to see a pattern. I was actually enjoying the game before, but now I was beginning to feel like I was trying to finish the game rather than enjoying it. But regardless, I was finishing this game, and so I made my way to the next attraction, Slime Flume. This is just Coffin Cruise again, but much harder this time. There's obstacles everywhere, including ones that will seemingly pop up out of nowhere. You basically just have to memorize where these are since you don't have the time to react when they show up. But by far the biggest issue I had with this attraction was the turning. Your controls only allow you to move left and right, so your way to turn is just by moving forward when you get to a turn. This would often cause me to suddenly bump into obstacles and lose time while having no way to even see that they were coming. This was super janky and really frustrating, and I just wasn't sure how to beat this at first. After cooling down, I was able to come back the following day with a clear mind and was able to get the gold. In hindsight, this attraction wasn't so bad once I learned some of the key strategies. Seeing the extra time items makes them tempting to go after, but sometimes they can just be bait, and you're better off dodging obstacles to save that time. The other big strategy that helped me win was learning to just take it a bit slower and focus on dodging rather than constantly paddling forward. This let me avoid more things, and with enough memorization, I was able to get through without too much issue and get the gold. I can't say I completely hated this attraction, given that it was at least more interesting than Coffin Cruise, but the fact that it was just a harder, more janky Coffin Cruise also just made it feel more frustrating to me. But not all the attractions here were terrible, because the next one was by far the best in Fever Swamp, Bogtopus. This is a ride on an octopus, but it's also like a boss fight. With what I think are beanbags, you need to take down the Bogtopus by hitting the eyes on its head to reveal its mouth. Each round gets progressively harder, with the ride moving faster and more pirates showing up. I thought this attraction actually had a pretty enjoyable learning curve, since I had to figure out how to deal with the pirates before they got my screamometer into the red. I also had to get good with the aiming, since the ride moving would cause your projectiles to curve a bit. When I finally beat the Bogtopus, it felt pretty good, and for the first time in a while, I genuinely had fun with one of these attractions. But there was still one remaining, and it was one that was not easy. Rub-a-Dub Slug is the final attraction of Fever Swamp. You have to help the slug deal with the worms coming out of all of his holes. To pull out a worm, you have to slide the stylus from side to side and then slide it up when it's ready to be pulled out. You can also fill the holes with anti-worm cream by sliding the stylus up and down, but it gets pretty difficult to do when you also have to focus so hard on the worms. If the worms stay around long enough, they start burping, and if they burp too much, then it's game over. This attraction wouldn't be so hard if it wasn't for the fact that to get the gold, you have to fill all the holes. I just couldn't do this on my recording setup, since moving the mouse that much was definitely gonna destroy my wrist. So I transferred my save file to my actual DS and was able to beat it. This was around the time I also discovered that there's actually a small speedrunning community for this game, and I was able to learn a pretty important strategy for this attraction. By sliding diagonally rather than vertically or horizontally, I could get the worms out easier, which was a big time saver in the end. In one attempt on a real DS, I managed to get the gold with roughly 32 seconds to spare, but my arm was on fire. I'm glad this only took me one attempt because I don't know how many more attempts I had in me. And with that, Fever Swamp is done. I decided to farm more tokens once again, and then made my way to the Mad Labs. When we arrive, we soon find Nate, who is actually alive and still ignorant of the park's malicious nature. The coffin he entered before apparently had a secret slide, which took him to Mad Labs. Other than that, he doesn't really say much else, so I just continued looking around. This place is kind of annoying to traverse, since everything is so far apart. I decided to start on the right side and tried Toxic Gunk Dunk. This game is another game where you throw a ball to hit targets, but unlike some of the throwing games, it's back to the janky sliding controls rather than just pressing a button. The horror in the dunk tank occasionally throws some slime at you, which obscures your view, but this attraction isn't too bad overall. To get the gold, you can't really afford to miss targets, which makes this a bit more difficult because the ones on the bottom screen don't leave you much room to slide the stylus. But I eventually got the gold without too much effort. This attraction wasn't really memorable to me, but at least I didn't have to suffer through it. Next up was one of the few games I was happy to see. A harder version of Bumper Carnage called Shock and Roll. This uses the same bumper car mechanics, but in a bigger and more dangerous arena. It's not very good for token grinding, but it is a much better challenge. Everyone has 5 health instead of 3, and you don't instantly gain health after damaging someone else. Instead, you have to manually pick up the health item they drop to gain that health. There's also giant bumpers that will bounce you around the arena, and there's these lightning obstacles that will stun you for a short time if you get hit by them. I managed to somehow win on my first try, but that's partially thanks to the final kid trolling at the very end by turning away from me, which let me destroy their car and win with seconds to spare. The next game I tried was Thunderbolt, but I ended up saving this one for later because of technical issues. So I moved on to the next attraction, Dreadmill. This attraction didn't seem too awful at first. It was another attraction where you make the protagonist run, and while I had some issues with Tilt-A-Web, I thought this would be fine. I've been through so much at this point that there's nothing that could faze me. Or at least, that was what I thought. And oh boy was I wrong. This attraction is easily the worst in the whole game, and my first few attempts will show you why. I start running, and soon enough, a box shows up. You have to jump over these, which seems simple enough. So I jump over the first box and suddenly begin heading backwards for some reason. I speed up, but end up going so fast that by the time I jump over the next object, I run into the next one. And even after jumping, I just phase through it and fall down. I was so confused by what just happened, so I tried again and... what? I just phased through the object again. I try again, and this time, after jumping over the first object, I just lose all speed and fall. So I try to go faster, but I go so fast that I just run into the lasers, get stunned, and fall. I kept trying and trying, but no matter how fast or how slow I went, it always ended the same goddamn way. After about 15 minutes, I finally managed to somehow get the bronze medal while still barely understanding how this game works. I kept doing the same things and failing in the same ways, totally confused as to why I was even getting far sometimes. Eventually, I would begin to understand the evil ways this game controls, and they are far worse than anything else in this game. The running is actually delayed, so while you might think that you're trying to run much faster or run slower to match the pace of the conveyor belt, you actually have to do that ahead of time. This is why I would suddenly fall after a jump, since I wasn't anticipating that I had to start running during the jump. This is also why I would sometimes just run straight into the lasers despite stopping for a few seconds, since it was still registering the inputs I put in seconds before I got close to those lasers. This is also when I learned that it's important to keep your speed up, since if you don't have enough speed, you'll phase through the box and fall. Through a combination of new strategy, muscle memory, and sheer will, I started to get some level of consistency in this godforsaken game. I kept improving, and eventually, I outran the Dreadmill, winning the gold without even needing the additional 10,000 points you get for surviving. This was a massive relief for me, and I knew that after beating that, I could take on anything this game threw at me. Next was Buzzwire, which was a classic carnival attraction where you have to bring the loop along the wire and to the end. This wasn't too bad after I got good enough at the controls, but they are a bit strange, since you have to use the touchscreen to move the loop. You can't really pay attention to the top screen while also making sure that you're moving exactly where you want to on the bottom, so you kinda just need to get a feel for it. Getting the gold wasn't too hard, but any satisfaction was pretty much gone at this point. Dreadmill had changed me, and I knew that the only thing I truly cared about was getting this game over with. Brain Drain is the next attraction, and it's just another version of that Flash Fright game from before. Instead of using a flashlight to get rid of the enemies, you need to lock onto these brains and quickly slide the stylus up and down to drain them before they drain you. It's a fine game, but nothing groundbreaking by this point. After nearly destroying my wrist for the sake of finishing this attraction, I headed back to Thundervolt. This attraction is honestly pretty cool, but it has some issues. Getting the gold was kind of unclear, since I was finding that there wasn't nearly enough points for me to get. I eventually found out that to get the gold, you need to be hitting combos, and that requires you to hit a bunch of stuff. But there wasn't really much to hit. The only things I could find that I could actually hit besides enemies and switches were these rocks floating around in the space sections, and there's not a lot of space sections. When I found this out and was able to get my combo up, I was able to build up a good combo and would have gotten enough points for the gold, but I was running into another issue. For some reason, this attraction would suddenly just stop and become a white flashing screen after this part. I tried two different DS's, and was still getting the same issue. So I wasn't sure if this was an issue with my hardware, or just an issue with the game. Regardless, I transferred my save file to my actual DS and was able to beat it first try without any glitches or issues. I wish I could have actually recorded getting the gold, but this is just gonna have to be good enough. Now that I had gotten all the frights in 4 areas, I figured it was time to get the ticket pieces in Fever Swamp and Mad Labs. It was pretty annoying to walk around aimlessly looking for the ticket, especially because I started on the right of Mad Labs, only to find out that the ticket piece is all the way over here on the other side. However, I will admit that this part of the game is pretty cool. Gigi will tell you that your ticket piece is inside the horror-only area, and to get inside, you have to buy the horror mask from the mask vendor to sneak in. After putting on the mask, the protagonist can't get it off and transforms into a horror, which I thought was a nice callback to the Haunted Mask. From here, you have to enter the horror-only area and find the ticket piece. This area is called the Secret Tunnels, and I found this to be pretty cool. It reminds me of all those staff-only doors that you see in malls that are kind of immersion-breaking, if that makes any sense. It's always interesting to me to see the inner workings of areas that you normally aren't allowed to see, and this was certainly no exception. I felt like it added just a bit more to the game's world building, and it was a nice change of pace after what I had just gone through. After finding our ticket piece, Horrifico finds us and transforms us back to a human. We manage to escape from him and head back to Gigi, only to find that she's been kidnapped. She leaves us a note telling us to win the final ticket piece by getting the gold on Pharaoh Fairways. After some more token grinding, we can now make our way to the final area, Terror Tombs. Terror Tombs was honestly a breath of fresh air after what I had dealt with from the past two areas. I started off with snakes on a chain, which is just Buzzwire again, but with a desert theme. I kind of hated the snake just moving all around the screen, but this game overall was nothing terrible. My only main complaint was these snake coils on the wire, which would sometimes get me because of the snake head being just big enough to collide with the loop. Still though, I managed to do this without much issue, and even damage boosted twice to get to the end. My next attraction was Beetle Battle, which is a worse version of batting cages in my opinion. Batting cages at least had the guys saying home run, but this just doesn't have the same charm. I guess I can't hate this game too much, but I heavily preferred batting cages despite the fact that it drove me batty. I decided to go for Mummy Run next, which was a harder version of Horrorland Derby from the beginning of the game. This was pretty difficult, honestly, since they put the jump holes right behind the fall holes, and if you fall when you need to jump, you actually just fall off a cliff and die. You're also getting chased by a mummy rather than racing against them, so if you fail to make the jump too many times, you get caught by the mummy and have to restart. I had so many fails on the first jump, but eventually I managed to get the God Run and hit multiple clutch jumps to win the gold. While I did struggle on this one for a bit, I can't really say I hated it. It was actually a decent challenge and required me to change my strategy when rolling the balls. I thought I was saving the best for second last, but as it turns out, this wasn't a bumper car game. This is Scorpion Speedway, the final unique attraction we'll see. This is a race, but with bumper cars. This made it pretty annoying to bump into the other drivers since you would just bounce off each other and lose all momentum. And given how thin the track is, you'll be bouncing into the other drivers very often. It took me a few tries to get the gold, but the key is just being able to drift well. I would start turning before the turns, and that would help me get through some tight turns to get ahead of everyone else and win the gold. With everything else completed, it was time for the final attraction, Pharaoh Fairways. And while I may not have saved the best for second last, I did save the best for last. This is another mini-golf game, which I was really hyped about. Of course, I managed to complete this one first try while knowing nothing about the holes. I had some really clutch shots here, and while I do wish I could have played it a bit more, I was more than ready to leave Horrorland once and for all. But this is Goosebumps, so there isn't some simple, happy ending. This ticket doesn't let us leave the park. It lets us ride the real final attraction, certain death. As much as I just wanted this game to be done, I have to say that I was actually kind of excited for this final attraction. And while it was difficult, it definitely did deliver. This is technically just a harder version of Calamity Canyon from the beginning of the game, but it was still fun. It's an incredibly chaotic minecart ride where you have to dodge all the crazy obstacles thrown at you. There's mummies walking around trying to take a bite out of you, boulders falling all over the place, spikes popping out of the walls, and so on. This definitely required some memorization to actually win, but I still had fun getting progressively better and better at it over time. And I was surprised to win the gold without too much issue somehow. I just got good at this ride and unknowingly reached the end, where we managed to save Gigi and break through the pyramid wall to the parking lot of Horrorland. Now, we're officially free. Nate is even here too, and he's finally realized that there's something wrong with the park. Our protagonist asks Gigi if she's okay, and... Gigi? Yeah, she's not okay. As it turns out, she's the Great Gargantua, one of Horrorland's scariest monsters. And now that she's free, she can turn the whole world into her own Horrorland. While part of me was thinking that there might actually be a good ending while playing through this game, this is Goosebumps. So of course it's going to end in some terrible way for the protagonists. The game ends with Nate and the protagonist just sitting there in silence, thinking about the horrors they've just unleashed onto the world, which is truly a fitting end for a game like this. And that pretty much sums up Goosebumps Horrorland. I was able to get all the frights and monster cards, so there wasn't really anything left for me to do after I beat the game. But I do have to say that I enjoyed the game overall. While there certainly were some rough patches, to say the least, this game definitely stood out more than I thought it would. I was originally going to title this video Horrifying for the Wrong Reasons, Revisiting Goosebumps Horrorland, but I didn't quite like that title because I still enjoyed it. I thought I was going to end up playing some generic game with a Goosebumps skin slapped onto it, but there was some real charm here. Nothing really felt out of place in this game, and when combined with those small details and references to the original works, I found this game's world and gameplay to greatly exceed my expectations. It was cool to just explore and see the sights, even if traversing some areas could be a little bit tedious. I'm honestly impressed that they were able to create something of this scale on the DS, and it just shows that there actually was some effort put into this game. I wouldn't recommend going for all the golds unless you're a psychopath like me, but most of the monster cards weren't too awful, and I did enjoy looking at them after I finished the game. And speaking of the monster cards, remember that tree monster I mentioned from the start of the video? Well, that just so happens to be one of the monster cards, which I guess makes me happy that I never got it as a kid. I used to not have the patience for this game, and I even struggled to find the willpower to finish it this time, but I'm glad I did in the end. I think the payoff was pretty good, and had I not spent hours getting all the golds on the annoying games, I could have enjoyed it a lot more. If you think you might be interested in a game like this, it's usually pretty cheap, and surprisingly, pretty much all of the versions play the same. Usually the portable versions of games are radically different from the home console versions, but these all generally play the same. So if you can only find one version of the game, you're gonna be getting the same experience regardless. It's worth giving a shot, especially during Halloween. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.